Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Wilderness and the American Mind, 5th edition, by Roderick Frazier Nash. Foreword by Char Miller. Narrated by James Anderson Foster. Foreword. Char Miller. Wilderness is contested ground. As a physical reality, wild land has been mined, dammed, grazed, and harvested, as well as hiked, skied, and boated. These economic and recreational uses are vociferously defended and decried. As a cultural domain, wilderness is no less controversial. Those who have sought to preserve the naturalness of coastal, mountainous, or riparian landscapes, or to keep prairies, wetlands, forests, or meadows untrammeled, have fought with those who would exploit the resources that they contain. Because these battles draw in grassroots organizations, state and federal agencies, and national interest groups, and because these struggles play out over decades, you need a scorecard to keep track of the shifting arguments and alliances. There is no better place to begin to understand the intellectual roots, political sources, and social significance of these epic brawls over the meaning of wilderness than this book. That Wilderness and the American Mind is now in its 5th edition and has been in print since it first appeared in 1967 signifies the enduring character of the struggle to come to terms with the natural systems that sustain the United States. It tells you, too, that its author, Roderick Frazier Nash, has vividly depicted the tensions animating our conflicted relationship with wilderness, and in doing so has given his many readers an analytical understanding of wilderness and a framework by which to engage with it. Not only did Nash capture the wilderness pulse of America, observes historian Michael Lewis, but he helped define that pulse, so that subsequent generations of environmental scholars and activists discussed American wilderness in Nash's terms, with his examples, and with his heroes. That's the definition of a seminal heuristic text. Some of the lessons Nash's book teaches are derived in different ways from his many decades running whitewater rapids that churn the turbulent rivers of the American West, work that began while he was a Harvard undergraduate. For me, keeping an oar in the water has always been a way to maintain contact with natural processes and wild places. Just as a scholar of the Renaissance needs to travel to Italy, I felt I was a more sensitive writer because I walked the talk in wild country. This book reminds that Nash became more sensitive to the humbling power of nature to disrupt, upend, or diminish human ambition, its capacity to frustrate our drive to claim control over that which we dub as wild. One such marker is the Colorado River's Lava Falls, which lies between Glen Canyon and Hoover Dams, and has, in Nash's estimation, a strong claim to being the most difficult stretch of runnable whitewater in the West. Those who make it past its violent, gyrating waters might give in to the exultation of the moment and be tempted to think you have conquered the rapid. Nash was not one of those. You never really beat the big ones, he cautions. The river just decides to let you through. I feel the same way every time I finish reading my dog-eared 1973 edition of Wilderness and the American Mind. By its heft, breadth, and ambition, not to say its narrative sweep, the book overwhelms even as it beguiles. Start with its backstory. When Nash began his doctoral studies in 1960 at the University of Wisconsin, under the direction of the legendary intellectual historian Merle Curti, there was no such thing as environmental history. Although some scholars and critics had written brilliantly about the human place in nature, notably Walter Prescott Webb, Henry Nash Smith, and Leo Marx, Nash realized that no one had explored the fundamental role that wilderness as wilderness played in the nation's imagination. Curti's support of his approach to establish the cultural context that explained the popularity of the idea proved decisive, a perfect formulation for the book to come, and one reason why it had such a profound impact on its first generation of readers. So did another lucky break. Nash convinced the university archives to hire him to gather, organize, and sort through the papers of Aldo Leopold, arguably one of the 20th century's most important conservationists, a perfect job for an aspiring historian committed to tracking alterations in Americans' ideas about nature. These changeable conceptions structure his text, even its opening words. Few books of any kind, let alone one on wilderness, begin with a lesson in grammar. But wilderness and the American mind does. For Nash, wilderness is an elusive term. It's a noun that acts like an adjective, a perception that, once acted upon, has real-world identifiable consequences. Yet, because it is so heavily freighted with meaning of a personal, symbolic, and changing kind as to resist easy definition, Nash's task becomes oddly straightforward. To trace this malleable concept's evolution across time, to make sense of how succeeding generations of Americans made sense of the wild, what he calls the self-willed, literally wild, world. He does so by assessing the wilderness advocacy of such iconic writers as Henry David Thoreau, George Catlin, John Muir, Aldo Leopold, and John McPhee, and by unearthing pithy political speeches that extol America the Wild. Newspaper editorials like varied forms of artistic expression and cultural production make good copy, as does the slow emergence of legislative initiatives designed to protect the public lands and the wilderness they exemplified, culminating in the 1964 passage of the Wilderness Act. Nash's close attention to such an interdisciplinary array of sources, and to some of the quirky details they contained, sensitizes him to subtle changes in tone, texture, and temper. One of these moments proved pivotal to his narrative and is emblematic of our understanding of a tectonic shift in American political culture. Until the late 19th century, wilderness was a place to be feared, fought, and flattened. This rough terrain and the native peoples who inhabited it, Euro-Americans argued, must be civilized, brought under control by gun, plow, and rail. No sooner was this end achieved, however, than a wave of nostalgia for the sharp, formative edges of the western frontier swept through the urban East. Consider the raucous acclaim surrounding the 1913 exploits of Joe Knowles, a modern, primitive man who went back to nature en naturel, a naked bid to reclaim his wildness in the Maine woods. 2 months later, his reclamation project was complete, and Knowles returned to civilization a changed man. Allegations that he spent his time in a well-furnished cabin did not dissuade the public from extolling his virtue, or from revealing their anxieties about how urbanization seemed to be unmanning America. This psychic crisis, reflected in literature, poetry, and paintings, helped tip the scales in wilderness's favor, Nash argues. From the perspective of city streets and comfortable homes, wild country inspired quite different attitudes than it had when observed from a frontiersman's clearing. Instead, the wealth that came from an industrializing society allowed urbanites to approach wilderness from the viewpoint of the vacationer rather than the conqueror. A newfound perspective, a revolution in meaning that gave birth to its inverse. Many of the repugnant connotations of wilderness were transferred to the new urban environment, the horrific implications of which were captured in The Jungle, Upton Sinclair's muckraking exposé of Chicago's meatpacking industry. Once reviled, a terrain to be grazed over, cut down, or plowed up, the idea of wilderness emerged as a tonic for all that ailed modernizing America. A remarkable transition then built on itself. By the early 20th century, an appreciable audience embraced the idea of wilderness's purity, a sensibility the contemporary naturalist John Muir deified through his odes to Yosemite and the Sierra Mountains, his range of light. In time, succeeding generations moved beyond the poetic appeal and drummed up a political demand for wilderness preservation. Among those who mobilized a legion of like-minded followers was Robert Marshall, a radical forester who in 1930 argued for the creation of an organization of people who will fight for the freedom of the wilderness. 4 years later, he established and underwrote the Wilderness Society, with Aldo Leopold as its president, launching a special interest for special places. As its members fought to secure wilderness designations for portions of the national forests and other public lands, a fitful and painstaking process, as they struggled to fend off dams on the Colorado and other western rivers that threatened to inundate cultural sites, submerge iconic landforms, and pacify whitewater, they also conceived of a broader resolution, the passage of a congressional act that would forever protect remnants of the wild. Over the next 30 years, the Society pressed its case on a reluctant Congress, with its indefatigable director Howard Zahniser taking the lead. Yet even the Wilderness Act, which President Lyndon Johnson signed in 1964, contained a number of qualifications, special conditions, and loopholes that diluted its regulatory authority, leading Nash to observe that these compromises were a classic instance of Americans' ambivalence about the relative merits of wilderness and civilization. The hedging has continued ever since. Despite the increased power of an environmental movement deeply attuned to the call of the wild, over the past 50 years its critics have been every bit as forceful in their denunciations of what they believe is an excessive regulation of resource development. The battles over dams in the mid-20th century have been superseded by early 21st century fights over the construction of massive solar installations and wind farms in the deserts, near mountain passes, and just offshore, the detonation of mountaintops to gouge coal out of the ground, and the employment of destructive hydraulic fracturing technologies to capture natural gas buried deep beneath the surface. Each of these threats, when combined with that posed by sprawling urbanization, subverts the cultural framing of wildlands as places of solitude, regeneration, and recovery, as integral to themselves as they are salves to the body politic. In Nash's reading, these ongoing tensions are also embodied in a related challenge, the creation of Garden Earth, that is, a thoroughly and completely managed planet scrubbed free of its gritty peripheries, a pastoral paradise whose roots run back through Thomas Jefferson's deification of the yeoman farmer to the Garden of Eden. Perhaps this vision of a homogeneous bucolic is inevitable with global population pushing 7 billion, but there will be a cost, Nash warns. Wilderness is just as dead in the garden as it is in the concrete wasteland. Once gone, it cannot be regenerated. Once lost, it cannot be found. Nash's insights into and worries about American culture are part of a critical conversation within environmental history about its methodologies and foci. What history does it seek to narrate? Whose history gains priority? Answers to these queries have changed since the field emerged in the late 1960s, partly in response to the publication of Wilderness and the American Mind. Indeed, most historiographical assessments of the field begin with Nash's work, an acknowledgement of its formative impact on scholarship and an identification of it as a baseline from which the field has evolved. One way to reveal this evolutionary process is through the questions historians ask and sources they employ to answer them. Donald Worster, for instance, observed that among the issues that the first generation teased out were the intellectual and cultural perceptions of nature, how these were illuminated in Americans' poetry and prose, their art and artifacts, laws, myths, and rituals. Linked to these ambitious and ongoing projects were initiatives tracing the influence that these varied perspectives had on politics and policy, the political economy of the environment, a paired set of topics that Wilderness and the American Mind does so much to map. But subsequent scholarship, more fully shaped by the natural sciences, reframed historical research around the natural world. How do ecological systems or animal and plant populations change over time and in response to human interventions and management? These queries have their analogues coming out of the social sciences, which lead historians to probe the disproportionate environmental burdens that the poor and disempowered bear when faced with air or groundwater pollution, or the gender differences and discrimination that women encounter within the domestic environment, the workplace, or the great outdoors. Then there are the human and biotic challenges that climate change is generating and will continue to generate, which we are only beginning to chronicle. Environmental history, whose origins may well lie in the wilderness studies, has become a much more complex academic pursuit. One sign of the field's growing complexity is that the very conception of wilderness as sacred, a pristine zone where, in Nash's words, humanity is an alien presence, is now open to debate. Some of the pressure to redefine the term comes from native peoples in the United States and abroad, communities that were expelled from their traditional landscapes as a direct consequence of the creation of wilderness areas and national parks in Africa, North America, and South America. It is no surprise that they reject the privileged conceit of untrod wildlands that led to their expulsion. Another who has contested the romantic vision of wilderness as free from human impress is historian William Cronin. In his provocative 1995 essay, The Trouble with Wilderness, or Getting Back to the Wrong Nature, Cronin argues that our embrace of wilderness as the antidote to civilization is flawed. Far from being the one place on earth that stands apart from humanity, it is, quite profoundly, a human creation. Indeed, the creation of very particular human cultures at very particular moments in human history. Because it is a cultural construct, wilderness is not free from the contaminating taint of civilization. Instead, it's a product of that civilization, and could hardly be contaminated by the very stuff of which it is made. Yet the power of the pristine is such that it has created a dualism in the American imagination, he asserts. My principal objection to wilderness is that it may teach us to be dismissive or even contemptuous of humble places and experiences. Without our quite realizing it, wilderness tends to privilege some parts of nature at the expense of others. One result of this imbalance is the devaluing of the urbanized areas that more than 80% of Americans inhabit, and the subsequent failure of the environmental movement to take these landscapes seriously, to nurture their naturalness. If wildness can stop being just out there and start being also in here, if it can start being as humane as it is natural, then perhaps we can get on with the unending task of struggling to live rightly in the world. Reaction to Cronin's criticism was swift, as wilderness activists and scholars rushed to defend the special status of wildlands, their inviolable character and cultural primacy. Many understandably invoked Roderick Nash in their critiques, an invocation that Nash seconded when he joined the debate. Acknowledging that to a geographer North America may never have been wild, given the enduring Indian presence across the millennia, he countered that wilderness, unlike mountains, canyons, and forests, is a perceived reality, a quality. It has more to do with the geography of the mind than of the land. That this perception has mattered and continues to do so is captured in the many ways succeeding generations of Americans employed this idea to describe their environment, with its attendant benefits and deficits. Chief among wilderness's many virtues, Nash concluded, is its capacity to rein in human hubris, the unfettered hunger for growth and development. Sure, people belong to nature, but that does not mean that 6 billion of them should be everywhere. Other species who cannot tolerate the highly civilized variety of humans have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness on their own terms. In this ethical concession and in the resulting policy prescription, island civilization, which Nash inserts in the epilogue, lies an important argument. Preserved wilderness is a gesture of restraint on the part of a species notorious for its greed. It's a symbol of hope that humans might turn out to be good ecological neighbors on this planet after all. This claim is particularly poignant in an age of changing climates, in which so many of our assumptions about what constitutes nature and the natural are being disrupted. Tundra, once defined as a frozen terrain absent of woody vegetation, is beginning to support this form of life. Invasive species, plant or animal, long have been the bane of ecological restorationists, and yet these newly arrived flora and fauna often herald an evolving ecological regime as a consequence of shifting meteorological conditions. What these alterations mean for the idea of preservation, of wilderness, is anyone's guess, though surely these terms will morph in meaning. While this new lexicon may not signify the end of nature, critic Bill McKibben's arresting term for the on-the-ground impact of human-driven climate change, it will delineate a sharp break in nature's history, and is one reason why some scholars already are asserting that the current geological epoch, the Holocene, identified with the end of the last ice age approximately 11,000 years ago, is over, and the Anthropocene, named to reflect the outsized human influence on Earth's climate, has commenced. Whatever this brave new world might entail for wilderness as a physical reality, there is no doubt that our conceptions of wildness will evolve along with our choices for how to act in these lands' defense. In this principled cause, wilderness and the American mind will remain a trusted guide for future scholars, students, and activists, not least because through its publication, Roderick Frazier Nash made wilderness history. Preface to the 5th edition. 50 Years in the Wilderness. Timing, it is often said, is everything. The axiom is a reminder to me that while this book may be a good one, even, some generously say, a classic, it is indisputably lucky. I caught the wilderness wave as it began to crest and became the beneficiary of the very intellectual revolution I described. As I write these words, the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act approaches on September 3, 2014. It will soon also be a half-century since the summer of 1964, when I completed the University of Wisconsin dissertation from which this book developed. But if, as an outside magazine poll claimed, Wilderness and the American Mind was one of the books that changed our world, then it must also be recognized that the world was ready to be changed. This book really began a long way from the wilderness, in an apartment on the island of Manhattan in the heart of New York City. It doesn't get much more urban than where I grew up. I could not see a single living thing from my bedroom window, which opened to a narrow alley and a solid brick wall. Once in a while, a pigeon feather would flutter down from the rooftop terrace 10 floors above. There were no stars at night in New York, and it was never really quiet. Yet this was precisely the context that nourished interest in wild places. Theodore Roosevelt's family raised him about 10 blocks away. Wilderness appreciation, in short, was an urban, not a frontier, product. If I had hailed from Moab, Utah, where I later lived for a while, I might well have chosen to write about cities in American thought. Yet, as it happened in 1960, as a beginning history graduate student at the University of Wisconsin, I approached Professor Merle Curti with a proposal to focus my doctoral research on wilderness. Assuming, quite logically, that wilderness had nothing to do with human beings, the professor gently suggested that I had come to the wrong campus building. Wouldn't the geology or biology department be a better fit for my project? In the few minutes left in our conversation, I managed to make the case that wilderness was not so much a place as a feeling about a place, a perceived reality, a state of mind. So why not a history of the wilderness idea? As I moved from Madison, Wisconsin in 1964 to teach, first at Dartmouth College and later at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and prepared a manuscript for publication, sweeping changes in American values and attitudes were fueling growing interest in wilderness and its preservation. We boiled down these changes into easy phrases such as 1960s environmentalism, the ecological perspective, and the counterculture. Rachel Carson launched an extraordinary decade with a New Yorker article on insecticides that, in 1962, became the book Silent Spring. Within a few years, another book that had languished since its publication in 1949 became a bestseller, Aldo Leopold's strangely titled A Sand County Almanac. It changed the definition of ethics for a generation of conservation-minded Americans. The Wilderness Act of 1964 added substance to Bob Dylan's observation about changing times. 4 years later came the defeat of plans to dam the Colorado River and the Grand Canyon. In 1969, Neil Armstrong looked back at Spaceship Earth from the moon. The first Earth Day and the National Environmental Policy Act followed in 1970. In the next 3 years, the Marine Mammal Protection Act and the Endangered Species Act showed that American politics and culture really did understand Rachel Carson's message 10 years earlier. Yale University Press published the first edition of Wilderness and the American Mind in 1967. The paperback edition cost all of $2.25. I concluded the book with speculation on the irony inherent in the rising popularity of Wilderness. It could be loved to death. The next 2 editions, 1973 and 1982, expanded the story to include the battles over the Grand Canyon dams and the status of wild country in Alaska. I also wrote about the meaning of wilderness for late 20th century American civilization and looked more deeply at the somewhat oxymoronic phenomenon called wilderness management. In addition, I examined the international significance of the American invention of national parks and legally protected wilderness. In the concluding pages of the 1982 book, I began to explore the future for wilderness on a rapidly changing planet. I looked at the need to control human population and sprawl and to find beneficent forms of centralization and the technologies that would make them feasible. I was also interested in alternatives to the anthropocentric arguments that had anchored the early appreciation of wilderness. Wild places had been valued and protected for people. Whether involving scenery, recreation, or the economics of nature tourism, wilderness seemed to be all about us. But a newer ecocentric rationale valued wilderness as a symbol of the capacity for restraint on the part of a species notorious for its selfishness. It is relevant that at this time I was writing another book, The Rights of Nature, A History of Environmental Ethics. It was a history of the idea that nature had intrinsic rights and that ethics should extend to a wider community. I was curious whether American natural rights ideology, taken to its logical limits, could lead some philosophers and activists to articulation of the rights of nature. This research helped me understand the significance of wilderness preservation as a way to share the planet and the evolutionary process with other species. By the time of the 4th edition in 2001, I was discussing the idea of reducing human impact on the planet with a new name: island civilization. The term occurred to me while looking at those familiar maps on which designated wilderness appeared as little green squares in a sea of country that humans had modified. Why not start thinking about turning that around? With the aid of technologies that might over time enable our species to reduce rather than increase our impact on nature, we could endeavor to put boundaries around civilization rather than wilderness. The epilogue in this 5th edition discusses those possibilities. Island civilization, I think, is one way to fulfill the evolutionary potential of our species without compromising or eliminating that of the other species with which we ought to share the planet. It seems appropriate at this point to pick up a few ideas from the opening of the 1967 first edition and introduce some new thoughts about the origin and meaning of the wilderness concept. Wilderness was the basic ingredient of American culture. From the raw materials of the physical wilderness, Americans built a civilization. With the idea of wilderness, they sought to give that civilization identity and meaning. Today, wild places enjoy widespread popularity. There is even fear of destruction by too many enthusiastic visitors and consequent limitations on recreational use. Yet for most of their history, Americans regarded wilderness as a moral and physical wasteland, fit only for conquest and fructification in the name of progress, civilization, and Christianity. The remarkable transformation that has replaced this attitude with appreciation is the concern of this book. It is all
Sample complete. Ready to continue?